in the second panel for this afternoon, as Adam mentioned in his earlier introduction, we also have 4 speakers, and just to run through them again, Nigel Inkster is going to talk primarily about cyber issues. Matthew Harris is going to focus particularly on the nuclear dimension. Ben will be looking at the defense management and higher management of defense issues. And Nicholas Redman will be looking at the economic dimension in his comments. So again, each of the 4 speakers will try to keep their remarks within 8 minutes, and we'll start with Nigel Inkster.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Sorry, my voice is going. I've been talking too much. I think I can do no better when starting to address this rather large topic of the future character of conflict by quoting the words of Professor Sir Michael Howard, one of our founding fathers at IISS, who said, "No matter how clearly one thinks, it is impossible to anticipate precisely the character of future conflict. The key is not to be so far off the mark that it becomes impossible to adjust once that character is revealed." I'm just about to inaugurate a new program here at IISS called Future Conflict and Cybersecurity, which is going to focus on the ways in which existing and emerging technologies will influence the future character of conflict. But before going into that, I just want to make one important point, that this is not a program that's only going to be focused on technology, and because it needs to remain rooted in the realities of conflict in which people remain the key factor. All of you, I'm sure, will be aware of the revolution in military affairs that was rolled out in the United States in the 1990s amid much fanfare, and which is now being eagerly and enthusiastically emulated by China. And the revolution in military affairs undoubtedly did deliver major benefits in areas like C4ISR, that's command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, I got that right, and precision-guided weaponry. But as my former IISS colleague, General H.R. McMaster, has said often and at length, to the extent that RMA created the impression that a combination of process and technology could somehow turn the battle space into an ordered and predictable environment, it turned out to be something of a false god. In many ways, the fog of war remains as dense and impenetrable as ever it's been. So what is the battle space in today's world, and who occupies it? The answer is a bit like the Force in the Star Wars movies. Nowadays, I think it's all around us, and it involves a lot, it involves a lot of activities that can be characterized as conflict, but which don't rise to the level at which the law of armed conflict would necessarily apply. And this is particularly true of activities conducted in the cyber domain, the newest of the domains to become militarized. We're also looking at a world in which the range of potential adversaries with which we may have to contend is expanding very rapidly, with a growing number of non-state and sub-state groups, some of which, like Lebanese Hezbollah and Islamic State, have military and intelligence capabilities that were once the preserve of a few advanced nation states. For the last couple of 100 years, we, in this part of the world, have been used to having a major technology advantage against many of our potential adversaries. That edge is not yet gone, but it is eroding quite significantly. If the Edwardian man of letters, Hilaire Belloc, were around today, he would be writing, "Whatever happens, we have got the Gatling gun, and so have they." And in all of this, I just want to say a few words about cyber, this latest major new disruptive technology with which we are contending. The latest in a series of such technology, starting with steam, going on to steel, electricity, the motor car, the aeroplane. technologies which don't fundamentally change us as human beings, but do quite fundamentally change the way we live our lives and organize ourselves. And like most of these new disruptive technologies, what you get is a kind of S-curve development, which we're now halfway up. The broad outlines of the new technologies are there, even though computing power continues to evolve very rapidly, and the applications of communications technologies are expanding all the time. But it takes us a lot longer to assimilate, come to terms with, and make sense of what this technology is doing to us, and that's particularly true for cyber. In terms of global security considerations, cyber's been the great leveler. Any state with a national telecommunications agency acquires the means to develop a signals intelligence agency, giving it a reach that was previously available only to a few top-tier intelligent powers. And activities within the cyber domain are essentially the same, whether the intention is espionage, sabotage, or war. About the only way to really distinguish between activities in the cyber domain is intent, and that is not always an easy thing to do. Incidents of physical damage generated through activities undertaken in the cyber domain are growing, and we now know that terrorist groups such as Islamic State are looking seriously at cyber attacks to cause major disruptions to cyber-enabled systems on which we increasingly depend to conduct our existence. Having said that, there still remains a top tier of major powers whose cyber capabilities need to be assessed in conjunction with a full range of other security and military capabilities at their disposal, up to and including space and nuclear weapons. And my colleague Matthew Harris will talk about the nuclear dimension of all of this. The cyber domain is highly contested at a national level and in a context where there are no clear definitions or rules of the road to regulate behavior. And international efforts to establish such rules have become highly politicized as states such as Russia and China seek through international negotiations to constrain US capabilities and erode the United States' first mover advantage in this domain, while the United States seeks to preserve this first mover advantage, though its ability to do so has, I think we have to accept, been significantly eroded as a result of the revelations of Edward Snowden. China in particular is now looking to use its throw weight as the world's largest internet user community, combined with its economic clout and ability to influence global technical standards as a major manufacturing country, to shape an internet that suits its purposes, which are primarily to achieve agreement internationally, preferably through a treaty, on cyber sovereignty, the right of states to monitor and filter content within their own sovereign information space. Because for a country like China or Russia, a key potential threat from the internet is that it might act as a vector for Western subversion designed to overthrow the regime. And we in IISS are actually already deeply engaged with China in paradiplomatic talks, looking at such issues as how the law of armed conflict might apply in the cyber domain, whether in what circumstances cyber deterrence might be possible. And we're also trying to talk to the Russians about this, but don't yet have the state buy-in that we would need to get this moving. In the light of the Snowden revelations, we also have to monitor how national and international pressures to legislate the activities of signals intelligence agencies may impact the capabilities, particularly of Western states, and to consider how concepts of secrecy that have been affected by a technology that has converted information from a scarce, valuable commodity into one that's cheap and ubiquitous. There's been a lot of talk about cyber warfare, but we actually have little idea what that might really look like. Is it possible that one state could bend another to its will solely through the exercise of power within the cyber domain? Or would such an attempt inevitably spill over into more conventional military areas? Are there cyber weapons that can cause irreparable major damage, or is it the case that once a cyber weapon has been deployed and used, the vulnerabilities that it exploits are exposed and susceptible to correction? Until recently, I've been relatively sanguine about the ability of a network of networks, which is what the Internet is, to be resilient and to a significant degree self-healing. But against that, I note that centralizing tendencies in areas such as data storage are potentially giving rise to greater vulnerabilities. And we should always remember in this context that security standards always lag behind the development of new applications. So new vulnerabilities are always emerging. We also need to bear in mind that most modern weaponry is cyber-enabled and in many cases also depends on space-based capabilities. We have to look at all kinds of new how new cyber-enabled weaponry might evolve up to and including autonomous weapon systems. As recent events in Syria have served to emphasize, armed UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, better known as drones, are no longer the new black of conflict, but increasingly the new normal. And we have to consider the security implications of the Internet of Things. Sensors embedded in a multiplicity of products communicating each other via the Internet without any human agency other than through the writing of the algorithm that enables them to function in the first place. And of course, there are many other types of technology that we could and in due course should be looking at, the evolution of which all has the capacity to influence the future course of conflict. These include nanotechnology, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, robotics, and CBRN, which we can expect to see deployed in new, ingenious, and almost certainly unethical ways. 3 decades ago, in the South Africa of the apartheid era, the scientist Walter Basson set out to develop pathogens that would kill blacks but not whites. Then the science of genetics was nowhere near sufficiently involved to make that a realistic objective, and I'm still pretty skeptical that anything like that could be achieved. But I think we need to accept that that in some of these areas, technologies which can be developed for the benefit of humanity can also be applied for malign purposes. So all of that's going to be part of this program, but I just want to finish by returning to my starting point, which is to emphasize in all of this that we mustn't be so mesmerized by the sort of whiz-bang factor of technology that we fail to give adequate consideration to the context in which it is being deployed and the human factor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for putting the cyber dimension of future conflict in that much broader context. Matthew Harris.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the role that nuclear weapons play in this landscape, and from the point of view of what might be termed Western interests, I'm going to paint a decidedly gloomy picture. On the one hand, 2 decades of trends in conflict since the end of the Cold War have added types of conflict in which nuclear weapons are barely relevant, if at all relevant. Asymmetric wars, non-state actors, cyber threats, and so on. On the other hand, it's becoming increasingly clear that there's a lot of strategic addition going on, but not much subtraction. These threats have added to the overall list of strategic concerns, but not without any of the more traditional threats necessarily being subtracted. The risk of major state-on-state conflict remains relatively low, but there still remain several competitions of interest between large and influential states, and those competitions are underpinned by deterrence relationships, and at the root of those deterrence relationships are nuclear weapons. And the role that nuclear weapons still play in the structure of international security is evident in material terms. All of the P5 states are modernizing or have announced plans to modernize their nuclear arsenals. And the US alone is estimated to be spending $355 billion over the next decade to modernize its nuclear forces, and up to $1 trillion over the next 30 years. In the NATO-Russia relationship, the competition of interest is now clear and much stronger than might have been hoped 5 years ago at the time of the US-Russian reset. And nuclear weapons are playing an uncomfortably large role in the current crisis, including the loose and threatening talk by Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin, over the possible role of nuclear weapons in the crisis over Crimea, but also a parallel and equally worrying breakdown in the Treaty on Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces, where the United States has accused Russia of violating the treaty, probably by testing a prohibited ground launch cruise missile. In East Asia, North Korea is no longer simply a proliferation issue, but a question perhaps of an emerging functioning nuclear arsenal. In the US-China relationship, a deterrent structure is emerging, but one that's highly complex, with heavy interplay between conventional and nuclear forces, in part because of the mingling of conventional and nuclear in China's strategic weapons and its supporting infrastructure. In South Asia, Pakistan, supposedly the fastest growing nuclear weapons power, with potentially the fissile material for up to 200 warheads by 2020, feels with some justification that it's achieved a strategic rebalance by developing limited nuclear options to deter a high-speed Indian conventional invasion. And the risk is that India in turn will be pushed out of its current posture of assured retaliation and engage in the development too of limited nuclear options. In the Middle East, the Iranian nuclear agreement means the immediate crisis of nuclear proliferation has been averted, but we're now faced with a secondary crisis of the potential spread of hedging nuclear fuel cycle capabilities. And all of this is happening at a time of acute crisis in the global nuclear order. The breakdown of the US-Russia relationship in arms control is a catastrophe, and it's a catastrophe with roots well before the invasion of Crimea. It's partly a matter of politics, but it's also a matter of the fact that the potential next stages in US-Russia arms control are extremely complex, mixing nuclear, advanced conventional, ballistic missile defense, and space assets. This is the Russian position that these things ought to be considered together, but they have a point. In non-proliferation, the Iran deal avoided a huge and catastrophic breakdown of the order, and that is a great success. But the next phase of threat will be extremely difficult to address, and the existing tools were not designed to deal with the consequences of the spread of civilian but dual-use fuel cycle capabilities. And at the same time, there is ongoing stalemate over the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. So the general picture is one in which Western opponents are doing things which increase the need for cohesive demonstrations of strength, including in the nuclear field. Nuclear weapons are still firmly embedded in the structure of international security. But for the West, the increase of salience of nuclear weapons is a trap. It is the West that has the most to lose from the increasing salience of nuclear weapons in security policy, and nuclear weapons becoming a vehicle for strategic competition. Again, nuclear weapons, in a general sense, blunt US conventional supremacy. Deployments of nuclear forces in response, for example, to alleged Russian INF violations would do nothing except reinforce existing patterns of hostility and instability. Also, the potential use by the West of nuclear weapons to a threat on the order of magnitude of the crisis of Ukraine is not credible. And reinforcing deterrence, in this sense, is not a neutral action, but a choice with political and diplomatic consequences. And what's more, Western publics, and Western European publics in particular, appear to have no appetite for such measures. At the same time, Western opponents are not demonstrating any inclination to respect existing rules of the game, while the new and more complex deterrent relationships that might be emerging do not have rules of the game yet drawn up. So why does all of this matter, and particularly to this audience? I think for this audience it matters because these abstract and theological discussions are bellwethers of strategic competition, and perhaps the clearest expression of where there are direct conflicts of interest that cannot be resolved simply through the mediating effect of diplomacy. So the strategic picture is becoming more complex. Whatever reduction in the relevance of nuclear weapons might have been hoped for does not seem to have happened, and yet a return to a world in which nuclear weapons are highly relevant in strategic terms is not one in which the West, broadly conceived, profits. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Matthew, for that very concise but I think comprehensively worrying brief survey of the continuing salience of and perhaps increasing salience of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much. Ben.
This week there's the Defence Security and Equipment Exhibition taking part in the Excel Centre at Docklands, and a building whose volume I calculate as 1,000 times this room's volume is stuffed full of defence, military and security technology. Now, in the IISS military balance, we give as good an assessment as we can of military capability in the round. There's a lot of technology in there, but also there's a lot on training, on organisation, on logistics, on doctrine and concepts, and perhaps the most important factor that's been very starkly exposed over the last 15 years, leadership at every level from corporal to head of government. Now, the first DSEI to be held in London was held in 2001. And you would have seen it stuffed full of technology, but it would have been technology that embodied the revolution in military affairs. And what you would have also seen is on display was the aspirations of the armies, the navies and air forces of the Western world for advanced conventional weapons. We've had a bit of a hot war since then, well, two, Iraq and Afghanistan. And in DSEI right now, you will see that many of those advanced conventional weapons have not materialised, in part because of the hard lessons of those wars, and in part because of the opportunity cost of the costs of funding them. But you will also see that armies and also to a certain extent air forces, but much less navies, have really gone through quite a dramatic evolution. Now, the revolution on military operations basked in the warm glow of the successes that Western forces had in the 1990s, particularly Desert Storm, Bosnia and Kosovo. And many key decision makers in the West had been misled by the proponency of this, that networks, that very high effective surveillance, and that all sorts of other ways of achieving a high tempo would lead to the comprehensive defeat of a less networked force. Well, that did happen in Afghanistan in late 2001 and Iraq in early 2003. But because that very proponency has led the US and many of its key allies, including astonishingly, for example, the British Army, to neglect actively the study of insurgency and counterinsurgency, we see many of the difficulties that have occurred over the last decade or so. And the first lesson you take away is that military capabilities must be tested against the spectrum of conflict. Now, there was a strategic shock around about mid-2003, the ferocity of the armed opposition in both countries, and against opponents who were determined to fight to the death. International forces who were unable to fight or whose governments were not prepared to allow them to fight were of little utility and actually added military drag. So the wars reaffirmed that combat is the core military capability and that armed forces should be benchmarked against determined and capable enemies, the Premier League rather than the local part-time team. Now, military operations in both these wars were largely amongst the people in urban areas of both countries and the densely populated breadbaskets of southern Afghanistan. And they were contests for the minds of the populations, the insurgents, the militias, and their leaders. Now, the established principles of insurgency and counterinsurgency, principles established over 50 years before applied. There was a political dimension to all military operations, right down to the tactical level. Information operations, propaganda, and the battle for the narrative was important. And these are likely to be enduring factors that are currently applying, for example, to the conflict against ISIS, and they're probably likely to apply to the majority of armed conflicts we're going to see in the future. Now, there were many military capability lessons of these wars, and in a sense, many of the building blocks of the RMA were reapplied, but in a completely different context. For example, to reduce civilian casualties and collateral damage and the erosion of legitimacy, the US and its allies sought to use force with increasing precision and discrimination, including highly restrictive rules of engagement and increasing use of precision bombs, missiles and artillery, linked to increasingly capable intelligence, surveillance and command and control capabilities. And we saw the exponential growth in aerial surveillance, particularly by unmanned aerial vehicles. And networking all these together allowed, with the combination of sophisticated intelligence analysis, allowed, for example, the effective attack of enemy networks. Special forces had an increasingly important role in this, but it wasn't an exclusive role. So air forces involved in this conflict and armies changed greatly. But you don't see that sort of evolution with navies, and I think the Royal Navy is a case in point. But, of course, international forces in Iraq and Afghanistan enjoyed largely uncontested control of the air, the electromagnetic spectrum, made extensive use of contractors, large operating bases, and extraordinary efforts were made to protect troops, often reducing their utility. And those conditions wouldn't necessarily apply in future expeditionary operations, particularly those mounted at short notice or against a capable enemy. So what we now see is Western governments seeking to avoid similarly costly and unpopular interventions, in part by building the security capacities of fragile and failing states or states that are of risk. Now, the lessons of the last painful decade or so suggest this should not be solely a military effort. It's been multi-agency from the outset. But the military component of it has got to have credibility and effectiveness, which depends on a demonstrable combat capability, but also understanding insurgency and terrorism and the ways of countering them. And despite the hard lessons of the last decade, I would strongly urge that the US and its allies discards those key capabilities that are as much intellectual as anything else at great risk. I think the middle and senior military management of the US and its allies would go on and say there's an important soft lesson. And that is actually that strategy is needed to align ends, ways and means to achieve effect. And the coalition, the US and NATO, struggled to achieve this for much of the last 15 years, exacerbated by multiple failures to adapt to unanticipated and changing circumstances and suboptimal leadership and decision-making, for example, in Washington, D.C., here in London, CENTCOM, Baghdad and Kabul. So a key lesson is the importance of strategic leadership by heads of government, senior military and civilian officials. And strategy's got to balance end, ways and means to produce an interagency plan that can be used by the military, diplomats, development agencies, intelligence services and other organisations to formulate interagency operational level plans from which tactical plans can be developed. And this must have a backbone of a political strategy. If it doesn't, it's probably doomed to failure. And this is probably a lesson universally applicable to many government crisis activities. I'd argue right now it's applicable to the European migration crisis. Now, the wars also gave an uncomfortable reminder that force actually had wide utility, certainly for the Taliban, certainly for Shia militias in Iraq, and certainly for Al-Qaeda, and it now has it for ISIS. It also at times had utility for the US and its allies, for example, in achieving the effects of the surges in Iraq and Afghanistan. And right now, as Emil said, we're seeing covert support for proxy militias run by Quds Force, which, by the way, is an exemplary interagency organisation because it includes Special Forces intelligence, and Qasem Soleimani has the political lead for all Iranian activity in Iraq, Syria and the Lebanon. You know, we're seeing another model of doing this. The wars also confirm the inherent unpredictability of war, where the enemy has a vote and is prepared to fight to the death to cast it. So war's a clash of wills between actors, shaping events to suit their political aims, seeking to gain and exploit all the advantages they can. So, of course, there'll be a variable constellation of attrition, manoeuvre, symmetry, asymmetry, and action-reaction dynamics on all sides, all of which was very inconvenient to the proponents of the RMA. So where are we now and where are we going? Well, you've got persistent and evolving non-state threats, all of which are busy trying to outmaneuver their opponents, and there's constant action-reaction dynamics. But you've now got state-on-state friction increasing, as we heard earlier this afternoon. So the major powers, the US and its allies, face very divergent challenges in constrained circumstances. And the United States is struggling to maintain its military preeminence as others continue to rise, particularly as they're increasingly also applying these technologies, for example, for anti-access and aerial denial capabilities. Now, of course, there is this Western recoil from boots on the ground, though I think at some stage there'd be some level of atrocity, for example, in civilian and military casualties, that could change Western calculations. But the prospects in the maritime, air and cyber domains are also very much in flux. But where we are right now is after a decade and a half of hot war on land, which has hugely evolved, changed and transformed the armies involved and those bits of the air forces that have been involved, we're at a strategic inflection point that really offers some hard choices, even for the prosperous countries who are investing an increasing proportion of their national prosperity into defence budgets and outside Europe. But I think the really hard lesson is whatever the combination of ends, ways and means and strategic challenges that nation states are faced with, it's strategy, strategic leadership, and having hard and uncomfortable conversations within the organs of government. That's the key thing, that's the key to unlock getting it right.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that survey of the implications of some of the lessons of recent conflicts in which Western armed forces have been involved. And finally on this panel, Nicholas Redman.
Thank you, Tim. When looking at economic instruments and how they are potentially likely to be used in the future by drawing on some of the recent examples, I incline to the view that economic power is best used to shape the environment in which you and other actors operate. That can be a more effective way of achieving goals than instrumentalizing or weaponizing a particular economic attribute. Some of the things that Nigel said before about China shaping the internet to suit its own purposes is exactly what I have in mind. This creates commonalities of interest and it changes cost-benefit analysis when decision time approaches. I have in mind particularly a meeting I had with, at the last Global Strategic Review with the foreign minister of a usually reliably pro-Western African country, who's, I noticed, had abstained in the vote on a UN Security Council General Assembly, the General Assembly vote on Ukrainian territorial integrity. And when I asked why this was the case, the answer that came out was, in essence, China and Russia are everywhere these days, and you don't upset them unless you really have to. And this is an example of passively rather than actively exerting influence by shaping the environment. One environment I have in mind particularly here is the global institutional setup, the space that 25 years ago was inhabited by the IMF, the World Bank and GATT, and now is a rather different space with GATT having morphed and changed into the WTO. But we're on a cusp here where the WTO might well have run out of road with the Doha round basically deadlocked. Over the last 10, 20 years we've seen a bewildering number of regional trade agreements, preferential trade agreements and plurilateral trade agreements. Now beyond the trade side, on more the fiscal support side and the developed financing side, we're seeing very different sort of institutions. The BRICS Bank, their new development bank, the BRICS Contingent Reserve Facility, and now most recently the proposed Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. The BRICS Bank, the new development bank in and of itself, it doesn't seem to be as necessarily a direct challenge to the existing order. A lot of development projects in any case are done through sharing, and so another lender to the party is not necessarily a bad thing. But the contingent reserve facility seems to me is potentially a very direct competitor to the IMF, and the day could come if the BRICS are willing to use their money for more political purposes, where they could offer an alternative to the IMF. So there are many, I think, aspects of shaping the environment that I could talk about, but I want to focus more on some instruments. And the one that looms largest for me is not actually the oil weapon, as Adam alluded to, but rather the financial weapon, or to be more precise, financial sanctions as an enabler of economic sanctions. And I'm thinking here of the sanctions that were imposed on Iran, to an extent those that have been imposed more recently on Russia, also sanctions on the Syrian government. Sanctions are an often used tool of statecraft, even though their effectiveness has been, at best, mixed. A key problem from the outset has always been securing universal application of these sanctions. Globalization arguably has made this even more difficult. As world trade has increased, the connections have multiplied. It's much easier for a target state to find new supply and also to find new markets if the sanctioning state is closing its own markets to them. Yet, what is interesting is how the financial system has developed, because globalization of finance, with the dollar at its heart, has actually put now threads and skeins of influence right around the world. And the sanctions on Iran over its nuclear program are focusing and targeting its oil exports, and its receipt of those oil exports is a classic, is I think an example of something that was so effective and relatively easy to impose that it's a tool that I suspect may be used again in future, and has already been used to some extent against Russia. What the United States was able to do, because every dollar payment ultimately has to go through the Federal Reserve, is to give every economic actor that had any dealings with Iran a straight choice. Deal with us or deal with the Iranians, and you cannot have both. And that was why it was so effective. In addition, the fact that the Europeans were also involved, the Europeans added SWIFT, and also because most insurance of ships is arranged in Europe, that made those sanctions doubly effective. And the financial effects also were able to deal with some of the Iranian workarounds. I'm thinking particularly of the gold deliveries, Turkey back to Iran via the UAE. So it gets over the universality problem, and this is what I think is so interesting about it. So in this sense, this is, because everything is currently based around the US dollar and Europeans to an extent, this remains, to nod to Nigel, the Gatling gun that we have got and they have not. The question is what might happen in due course, what might happen when China has developed a financial market of sufficient size that it could begin to exert some of that influence and learn some of those lessons, or indeed another country. I think if this is to happen, it will happen many years from now. China has certainly taken a good deal of deliberate steps to internationalize the renminbi, opening up offshore trading centers, insisting increasingly on the settlement of its own trade in renminbi, encouraging some Asian central banks in particular to start holding renminbi for import cover purposes. But I think what happened last month is an indicator of just how far we have to go. If you remember, in first half of August, there was a 3.5% shift in Chinese currency, devaluation. I couldn't believe newspaper commentary saying this is a competitive devaluation. Competitive devaluation is never 3.5%. They're big double digit. They don't turn the clock back 3 months. They turn the clock back 3 years. So with that explanation dismissed, what was the reason for this? I think it was almost certainly that the IMF had been hinting heavily enough that the possibility was still there for the renminbi to enter the special drawing right basket, and moving in the direction that the market wanted to nudge the renminbi was therefore the sensible move. But what we have seen since then, the de facto capital controls, the extraordinary levels of intervention in the market, I think underline just how difficult it is for Beijing's leopard to change its spots, and without changing those spots, I think it's going to be very difficult for the renminbi to become an international currency that could seriously challenge the dollar, whether it be as a store of value or as a reserve currency or as the center of a new system. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that it took the United States the best part of a century to build up the credibility and the institutions and predictability and the reputation before it finally replaced sterling at the top of the pile. And that once the economic button passes, the financial button can take another, several decades in order to move across. It was a lesson of US rise and the more gentle and managed decline of sterling. That's on sanctions. A few words on energy, because I know I'm running very short of time. Energy, I incline to the view again that this is something where energy supplies are more an environmental, or more effective an environmental factor than something can be weaponized. I fully confess that I'm thinking mainly of Europe here and the situation with Russia. And what we see is that fuel matters, market matters, and physical connections matter very much indeed. So it's been much more gas than oil, but I have a suspicion that the rise of LNG globally, the increase in number of LNG terminals, the opening up through unconventional of new centers of production is eventually going to make gas more like oil and therefore less easy to weaponize, which is not to say that it cannot be used, but I suspect it's going to be a declining one. Also for the reason, and I'll cut to the chase there, I find it difficult to disagree with the argument that Russian energy cutoffs have actually worked, or that they've done Russia many favors. I'd argue that Russia did much better when gas supplies to the former Soviet states and to Eastern Europe were flowing and the pro-Russia business constituencies were left in place rather than being taken out at the knees. And we have a situation now in Europe is there's a much more determined push to limit Russian market presence, and that will change the domestic dynamics in those countries. That's not to say, however, my closing point is that non-state actors, however, will certainly be interested in the oil weapon. Yesterday, I took the liberty of dipping into the armed conflict database to call up some attacks on energy infrastructure, and it's astonishing how many we've had in the last 6 months. Mortars being lobbed at the Kirkuk-Ceyhan pipeline, Nigerian Delta, more bunkering attacks, Al-Qaeda in Sinai blowing up gas pipelines, more attacks in Myanmar and other places. For non-state actors, this is quite an important way of fighting governments and denying those governments their revenue.
Nick, thank you very much for your comments, which have neatly concluded a broad array of viewpoints on the instruments that are likely to play important roles in the future exercise of power and in conflict. We now have about 25 minutes for discussion, and I know that our panelists will be pleased to answer questions from our audience. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Martina Timmermann. I've come over from Berlin today. I'm not government. So I must say I'm quite amazed. I'm in the UK. And in this whole discussion, there was no mentioning of India. So last year, I think it's about 12 months ago or so, when I checked the website of the Ministry of Defense in India, they were announcing 500,000 cyber warriors to train. First, I thought, I made a mistake with the zero, but no. When I checked it again and again, that was the number. Now, why is there no mentioning of India here? In several aspects. I don't want to go into that. Second, I'm also missing Israel. If we talk about cyber, why is there no mentioning of Israel in your understanding? Of course, 8 minutes, I admit, but still. US and Israel, they are forerunners in this aspect. Second, third, I'm sorry, now it's your turn, actually. But just recently, I was invited to the Gamescom opening in Cologne. May sound a little bit off the track here right now, but it's not. one of the most important, most successful games played by 80 million to 90 million people is war games. Now, if we talk about education and, now we think cross, yeah? If we talk about education and Air Force training, I refer to, and now I'm back to India, Times of India yesterday. I don't know if you saw the article. They were announcing how they want to train their young people, Air Force pilots and so on, via games. Now, my question is, how do we get this into the picture of the future here?
Thank you very much, Nigel. And then Ben.
Okay, well, you're right. I only had 8 minutes to try and cover a lot of territory. The reason I didn't mention India or Israel in this context are different reasons, but essentially I don't think they are the countries that are going to make the international weather in the cyber domain in the way that the United States, Russia, and China have the capacity to do. Israel is a country with very short time horizons and a very strong focus on its own interests and survival, understandably, given the way it came to be. And it's certainly the case that Israel has some very developed cyber capabilities. These capabilities are sometimes shared, sometimes not. The United States has, shall we say, a rather complicated relationship with Israel in this regard. But whatever, we need to remember this is not just about the technology. My first point. On India, yes, they have aspirations, but let's not forget that India is a country where only about 20% of the population is connected to the internet, as compared with China, where it's about 70% and rising. So I think we've got an interesting situation in India where they see where they've got to go, and they've actually got some quite developed doctrines for getting there. But the kind of underpinnings that would make this a reality are still in relatively short supply.
Ben.
I take part in the Institute's South Asia programme, and I don't think there's anyone else from the programme here. India has enormous potential, but it's actually fallen behind China. In 1947, India was ahead of China. Now, in many respects, it's fallen behind. And I'm afraid for the Indian military to realise the enormous potential of India, it's got to overcome some self-imposed bureaucratic handicaps. And also India, as it uplifts itself, needs to uplift its educational system. On Israel, our analysis in the Institute is that urban operations is increasingly going to be the new normal. Now, most armies, navies and air forces in the world, in my judgment, are inadequately preparing for this. The one that I know is Israel, because it has the most developed urban warfare training facility of all. And its various wars in Gaza have allowed it to evolve a more sophisticated approach to urban operations. And there is much that many other militaries, I think, can learn from them. What you also see in Israel is a very close relationship between defence industry and the military, and indeed the political class, because many in defence industry and the political class are ex-military or in the reserves. And that has enabled them to develop some very high technology equipment, which is selling extremely well. And you would only need to walk around DSEI to see that. The business about simulation, one of the quiet revolutions over the last 15 years has been the application of simulation and virtual reality technology to the military, largely to help them with training, and most of the R&D has been paid for by the civilian games industry. And indeed, you can now do things with all sorts of simulation that you couldn't do before, including a very high degree of experimentation and mission rehearsal, which was inconceivable when I joined the military. But against that, there is a great danger of over-relying on it. And if I may, the BBC did a short feature about a year ago of some British Sandhurst-trained officers who went for a week with a Chinese military academy, one of the 14 ones, where it seemed to me that they were making good use of civilian wargaming technology as part of the programme, but they were making far too much use as opposed to really getting out and muddy and dirty on the training area. And it certainly showed in the military competition that they were involved in. And there's no substitute for doing things on a training area, including with live ammunition, for all three services to building up credible combat capability, leadership and confidence.
Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you. If I may go back to the point you made about the reason why you didn't cover Israel and India was the fact that you don't see them as shaping the cyber domain or influencing the cyber domain. A point I would like to make and then ask your observations on is the key traits of cyber warfare in particular, as far as I can see it, are deniability, low cost, and extremely easy to delegate to either a proxy or to a non-state actor, in particular criminal organisations and terrorist organisations. Precisely because of that, you don't need to have a large infrastructure, and precisely because of that, groups or countries like Israel and India can theoretically rebalance their own strategic capabilities very quickly and very easily by selling it off to the highest bidder.
I don't dissent from that. I made the point in my presentation that cyber in this regard has been a great leveler. It's cheap and cheerful and pretty much anyone can do it. The nexus between state and non-state proxies is also well established. I think it's generally and widely accepted that in the case of Russia, for example, there is a kind of Mephistophelian pact between the state and organized criminal groups, whereby the latter are broadly allowed to get on with it and develop exploits for their own purposes, provided they don't do direct these against Russian targets and provided they make these capabilities available to the state on request. So it is indeed very easy to subcontract this kind of thing. And so yes, I mean the fact is that a number of states find themselves acquiring an agility and freedom of maneuver that would not previously have been possible. And I do agree with that. But I think that in terms of shaping the kind of global environment, how these things are done, if there is going to be any kind of regime that establishes constraints, norms of behavior, ways in which this anarchic situation can somehow be constrained and controlled, it's going to be the big players that are going to do it, not the Israels and the Indias.
Thank you, Nigel. Ben?
My judgment is that cyber is with us here and now, but its priority is as an intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance aid, particularly the developing ability to monitor what's going on social media in near real time. Clearly it can be weaponized because cyber weapons are being used every day by criminals. What's going to be key for armed forces is can they develop a gearing between whoever's doing this cyber stuff and the tactical forces. Because if they've got good cyber weapons, but they're too secret to actually make a difference to a brigade attack or an amphibious landing, then they might as well not exist. And in fact, the money's been wasted. And there's been too many secret weapons fielded by armed forces in the past where they haven't actually managed to overcome that gearing trick. I'd also observe that adversaries who understand the cyber capabilities that are used against them may well be able to counter them in very old-fashioned ways, such as by just turning off their devices.
Thanks, Ben. There was a hand over here some time ago. I can't remember exactly where. I think the gentleman in the front.
There's a lady in the back. Okay.
Thank you. Glenn Evans. Nigel referred or touched on the democratization of technology and the fact that now more or less anyone can have access or can develop tools to damage society, other people, In other words, the instruments of warfare are no longer a matter for armed forces. They are now well out of the stable and down the road to anyone who, any of the ungodly and others beside who might be curious. On the other hand, you have an extraordinary trend of what you might call the sort of networkization or Facebookization of the global young. And I wondered if you were looking at, anyone was looking at how these two trends are developing in parallel. Someone mentioned that young people, Matthew, I think, are anti-nuke, they're green, they like festivals, they don't broadly want to kill each other. But how do these two trends balance each other out? Has anyone looked at this?
It's a good question. I'm not aware that anybody has actually addressed the issue in quite those terms. And I think also we need to be careful about making too many generalizations about the attitudes of young users of modern technology, networking and social media. Because, after all, let's not forget that it is young people predominantly that are using social media to advance causes like that of Islamic State, and there is there is not too much evidence of liberality or goodwill towards their fellow men evident in such behaviours. I think we need to bear in mind that the technology, like Spencer Chapman's jungle, is neutral. It's neither for us nor against us. It's what we do with it, and there are as many ways to use it as there are different actors trying to do so.
Just 2 points. One is that, as Nigel just said, that there's no evidence to suggest that the presence of technology is by itself changing the opinions or attitudes of younger people. What it is perhaps doing is making them less easy to centrally control and more vulnerable to influence by actors who would not previously have had the means to influence those opinions. The other thing is, I think, and it relates to the last question as well, is that it's perhaps worth drawing sharper distinctions between the type of weapons that are supposedly being democratized. And I think it's fair to say, although I would be corrected by Nigel, that a cyber weapon, for example, that is designed to have a physical effect at the end, that might require sophisticated and detailed intelligence on its design, that might require a lot of time and effort in designing in order to remain covert, that might require persistence over a long period of time in order to be later used, could, generally speaking, be said to say something that requires a state hand somewhere, at least at the minute. So, whereas the softer democratizing information tools are much more rapidly, cheaply, and democratically available.
Thank you, Tim. Andrew Brooks, a member of the Institute. In the old days, when I was flying, the Brits could afford atomic weapons, the whole panoply of weaponry in their Gulf bag. Arguably, we're not in that position anymore. If we have to make decisions between, say, for example, a Trident replacement, which is largely a political, keeps us in the P5, etc., or denuding the conventional forces and the cyber anti-forces because we can't afford the whole Gulf bag anymore, what does the team think we should give up on?
I reject, I'm afraid, Andrew, the statement that's often made that the British nuclear weapons are largely political. If Britain was involved in a conflict with another nuclear power, they wouldn't be just political, they would be military. And what we've seen is the development of substrategic nuclear capability, clearly by Pakistan, a subject actually the institutes published a lot of analysis on. That also drives, for example, the retention with the consent of NATO members of battlefield nuclear weapons of US ownership in NATO, so a nuclear power that decided to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for additional conventional capability would be having to accept a whole new level of risk and judgments of the relative threats, nuclear, conventional, and unconventional. And I think that's a very hard judgment call for any government to make, let alone the British. I mean, we have done quite a bit of work on it in the Institute, and I can commend to you a couple of panel discussions that we've had over the last couple of years on the British nuclear deterrent. But I think it is it's a trade-off question, a political military trade-off question, but it's a much more difficult one than, say, the balance of anti-armour weapons between aircraft and armoured vehicles.
Thanks, Ben. Matthew, do you want to answer?
Yeah, only to add that, it's not a direct answer to the question, but only to add that I think the British debate is made so much more complicated by the fact that, firstly, the fact that because the UK has one delivery system and one warhead, these debates now are about whether every debate about sustaining capability is a debate about whether the UK has nuclear weapons or not as a binary. But secondly, also that for the UK, the alternatives in between the current system and zero appear to be so unattractive in various ways. And the Trident Alternatives Review produced an answer based on specific calculations that it would take too long to build a new warhead to go on a cruise missile, so that in order to sustain the current level of capability, you'd have to build new SSBNs anyway, making it more expensive. What I would find really interesting would be if a leader came to power in the UK who was willing to make the political judgment that a explicitly lesser capability was acceptable, that it would be worse, but that this was a trade-off worth making. Because at the minute, the question that keeps being asked is, can the UK sustain, can the UK fill its current deterrence requirements with a different system? An interesting question would be whether someone came to power that was willing to say, can we do something less effective and worse, but still greater than nothing?
Benedict Gotte with Crossbow Capital. Just a quick remark on your remarks on the dollar, the reserve status, etc. I think if you just remember how U.S. mortgage-backed securities were rated in 2007, they were AAA, AA, and the perception in the market changed rapidly. It took about 12 months, 18 months, and it was toxic. So I think in financial markets, it's not necessarily the reality, it's the perception that counts, and that can switch very quickly. And I think in the case of the dollar, it could be that it's not necessarily the dollar that it's not necessarily that the Chinese yuan that becomes so much better, but maybe it's the dollar that becomes so much worse, just temporarily, and that would already be sufficient to trigger a wave of confidence for other currencies. But that's just on a side note. Actually, it's interesting that I passed the mic to you because I wanted to push into a similar direction in regards of the question, social media and power. The discussions that I've heard today to me seemed a little bit, and please don't be insulted, I'm asking this as a provocative statement also, seemed to me like a little bit very 20th century. What we're currently seeing in the internet is open source, is sharing, is decentralization. So we are currently commanding armies, we are currently commanding structures, C4I and command and control and everything. These structures could dissolve much more quickly than what we anticipate today. Already in the US, you see certain states that question the federal authority. Already in China, it's not much talked about, but you have regions there that are totally different than the coastal regions. So the question is, and it's more like, food for thought, aren't we talking here about ghost armies? Aren't we talking here about structures that we believe we can control, configure, command, that could dissolve, not overnight, but, maybe within 10 years, maybe within 20 years? The whole structure of power and political decision-making and shaping sentiment of entire populations could be radically different from now.
I think that that this is a very important important point, and of course the situation you describe is perhaps a slightly more Hobbesian variant of the vision that the founding fathers of the internet envisaged, a globalizing phenomenon that in a sense rendered traditional concepts of Westphalian sovereignty, national borders irrelevant. And this is what we're seeing at the moment in this context at a top international political domain is precisely a fight back against this. The assertion that sovereignty still matters, that the nation state is still the principal unit of currency in terms of international governance. And that is a fight that we're going to, we don't know, we can't anticipate what the outcome of that will be. But the decentralizing effects of these new technologies are certainly there, and we're indeed seen as part of the virtue of these capabilities when they were rolled out around the world. So yes, I mean that is a very valid point. At the same time, I think that we should not lose sight of the fact that these kind of decentralizing and federating tendencies, which are certainly evident, do potentially contain quite significant weaknesses of their own. If we look at the way social media has played a role in some of the major political and military events of the last, let us say, not quite decade, that impact can be overstated. Yes, for example, social media played a role in the Arab Spring, a mobilizing role. But actually, if you analyze how big a role that was, it was perhaps less. In some ways, there is less to this than meets the eye. Tweets from Tahrir Square, there weren't actually that many people tweeting, as it turned out. It's not quite like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the French Revolution, but sometimes the impact of these things can be overstated.
Yes, and I'd add that it's not necessarily all that difficult for an authoritarian or repressive government to close down social media that's critical or disruptive, and I think we've seen that in Thailand over the last year since the coup, where online criticism of the military junta has effectively been squished.
And in China we see this, that I think the Chinese authorities now reckon that they do have the whip hand in terms of controlling the use of social media within their own population. I think they reckon they've now got the technology, they've got the edge that enables them to allow a certain level of seemingly free discourse to take place, whilst at the same time having the capability to shut it down very rapidly and definitively in circumstances where it looks like taking an unwelcome turn.